Welcome back to Bible Basics with Annetta. Tonight we're going to be looking into the book of Samuel, or as it has been divided through time, the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. The books of 1st and 2nd Samuel were written by Samuel, and it is assumed by most scholars that Gad and Nathan, which were also prophets at the time, assisted in writing different parts of these books. We find that Samuel was the last of the judges. If you recall, last week we studied about the judges that were placed over the children of Israel, and they were the chosen ones to redeem and to lead the people of God in a godly life. And we learned that their cycle had maintained itself, that there would be a judge, they would raise them to revival, they would turn back to the one true God, and then as time progressed, they would turn their backs on God, and then we find them going through some kind of struggle, they were either in slavery, or they were captured, or they were defeated, or there was some kind of catastrophe, which would lead them back to the point where they realized that they need to be serving God once again, and there would raise up a judge to bring them back to the worship of God. We find that not only was Samuel a judge, he was also a prophet and he was a priest. And we want to learn just a little bit about Samuel, and it begins way before Samuel was even born. Samuel's father was Elkanah, and he had two wives. One of his wives was fruitful and had bore children to Elkanah, but his other wife, Hannah, who was Samuel's mother, was barren. She could not have children. And in those days, that was a huge issue because children were considered to be blessings of the Lord. It created status for the man whenever they had children. Hannah could not give children to Elkanah. So every year when they would go to the temple or to the tabernacle to give up offerings, Hannah would go and she would cry out to the Lord, she was begging for a child, basically. And she did this so much the last time that she was there asking for a child, that the priest Eli actually thought that she was intoxicated, which she wasn't. She was just crying out to God because she wanted to bear a child. So Eli sent her on her way, and it wasn't long until she was giving birth to Samuel. And as she had promised God that once Samuel was weaned, then she would take him back and dedicate him to God at the temple. So she takes him back one year when they went back for their annual sacrifices, and she left Samuel with Eli, the priest. And Samuel was serving Eli, and he was learning the ways of the priesthood. And there was one night whenever Samuel lay down to go to sleep, and he heard a voice that said his name, Samuel. Well, him thinking that it was Eli, he got up and he went to the priest Eli and said, Eli, I'm here. And Eli said, I didn't send for you, I didn't speak for you, I didn't call for you, so go back to bed. So he did, and this happened again. And then Eli finally realized what was going on. He said, when you go back next time, if the voice speaks, you say, here I am, Lord, please speak, because your servant is listening. And that's exactly what happened. And the Lord spoke to Samuel and let him know that he was going to be a chosen one of God. So we find Samuel as he grows up. He becomes not only a judge and a priest, but also a prophet of God. And he is called, if we see, that's that story that we just spoke about was actually in chapter 3. We learn at this time that Eli, the priest, his sons were very evil. They did a lot of evil things. Normally the sons would take over for the priest after he passed away, but these sons were very evil. We find that the Ark of the Covenant, which we've talked about before, was actually captured by the Philistines, and everything was kind of in a big mess. And Eli, then he finally dies, and his sons were slain. But then God began judging the Philistines because they had stolen the Ark of the Covenant, so it was returned to Beth-Shemesh, and then Samuel actually leads the children of Israel in revival. And he told them to put away their gods and to turn to Jehovah God, the one true God. And of course, he leads them into victory again. But then Israel starts, they actually reject God and demand a king. Now you understand that they had Moses, then they had Joshua, then they had the judges, and we are up to the end of the judges, and now the children of Israel like, we want a king, we want to be like everyone else, we want to have a king, and we want it now. And Samuel warns the nations about their choices of wanting a king. He's saying he's going to tax you more, he's going to put more responsibility on you, and the list goes on and on. But the children of Israel, they were for true and for certain that they wanted a king so that they could be like all the other nations. So Samuel, in speaking to the Lord told him, give them what they want. So in chapter 8 of 1 Samuel, we're actually going to read verses 7 through 9. And I'll be reading from the New Living Translation. It says, Samuel was displeased with their request and went to the Lord for guidance. Do everything they say to you, the Lord replied, for it is me they are rejecting, not you. They don't want me to be their king any longer. Ever since I brought them from Egypt, they have continually abandoned me and followed other gods, and now they are giving you the same treatment. Do as they ask, but solemnly warn them about the way a king will reign over them. So that's what we find is that God finally said, I've tried to lead them, I've tried to be the king, I've tried to do everything that's best for them, but they have continually rejected me and turned away from me and turned to idols, and I simply am not doing it anymore. So go ahead and give them what they want. Give them a king. So we find in 1 Samuel chapters 9 and 10 that a king was chosen. Saul was actually chosen as king, and he was anointed as king. In chapter 10 and verse 1, it says, Then Samuel took the flask of olive oil and poured it over Saul's head. He kissed Saul and said, I am doing this because the Lord has appointed you to be the ruler over Israel, his special possession. And so he actually told Saul that he was going to be king. God had chosen him to be king. And we see that he starts reigning. And in the beginning, Saul did very well. And in chapters 12, the transfer from authority went from Samuel to Saul. Because if you remember, Samuel was still a judge. So he transferred his authority over the children of Israel to Saul. But then Saul rebelled against God, just like the children of Israel had from the beginning. And he starts giving his rebellion just continued and continued until it got very obvious that he was in disobedience and rebellion. Whenever Samuel had gone to him, because he was still operating in the office of a prophet, and the kings at that time had a prophet that actually operated at the same time as they did, kind of as the voice of God to them. And he had sent Saul on ahead, told him to go into battle, told him exactly what to do, how he was supposed to fight. He wasn't supposed to leave anyone alive. Paul actually leaves the king of the territory alive. He kept the king of Agag. And while they were there waiting for Samuel to come and offer the sacrifice, Saul actually got a little bit overeager and impatient, and he actually offered the sacrifice in place of Samuel doing it, which was an office that he had not been appointed by God to hold. Saul was not a priest, so he had disobeyed God, and because of that, God told Samuel, I'm done with Saul. He is not my chosen anymore. The scripture in chapter 13 of 1 Samuel, and it's verse 13. This is the place where Samuel shows up to where Saul had just offered the burnt offering, something that he was not supposed to do. And it says here in verse 13, How foolish, Samuel exclaimed. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God gave you. Had you kept it, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom must end, for the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. The Lord has already appointed him to be the leader of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. So we find that his rebellion cost him his kingdom. So Samuel says here that God had already sought out someone else, and we find that God told him to go down. And if you read in chapter 16, God told Samuel to go down um, to where Jesse and his family lived, because God spoke to Samuel and told him that he was going to anoint one of Jesse's sons as king. Now, if you'll recall, we talked about a couple of lessons ago about Ruth, the book of Ruth. I think maybe that was the last lesson. We find that Ruth was the great grandmother of King David, because Ruth and Boaz actually beget Obed, and Obed beget Jesse. And this is the same Jesse where Samuel went down to his house, and it is at that point that Jesse brings all of his sons out to meet with Samuel, and every time one of the sons came by Samuel, he was certain that it was the one that God had anointed and chosen to be king. But God kept saying no. So finally he said, "Do you have any other sons?" asking this of Jesse. And Jesse said, "Yes, I have one young son that he's out tending the sheep in the pasture." So he said, "Send for him." And so they went and they got David, and they brought David down to be before Samuel. And God spoke to Samuel and told him, "Yes, this is the one, anoint him with oil." So Samuel actually anointed David there to be the king. Now, he didn't take over immediately, because Saul was not happy and he wasn't just going to step down from the throne. It was going to be a struggle. But David was selected and anointed. We find that it wasn't long after that we find the children of Israel in a valley with the children of the Philistines having a great giant, and they were taunting the army of the children of Israel, the armies of God. And the giant would come out every day and he would say, "Send me a champion, send someone that can fight me and defeat me." And Jesse sent David down with some supplies for his brothers, because they were there with the army fighting against the Philistines, although they were pretty much at a dead standstill because Goliath was challenging them, and there was no one there with enough nerve to go against Goliath. Goliath was over 9 feet tall. He was huge. He was this huge giant of a man. So finally David's like, he went to Saul. He said, "I'll fight the giant. I'm not afraid." And so he tried to put his armor on David. David could not do that, so he took off the armor. He simply went down to face the giant, and as he walked, he picked up some small stones, some smooth stones. He came upon the giant, and the giant's like, "Why have you sent a child out to try to fight me?" And David looked at Goliath and he was fearless. He said, "You come to me with, shields and swords, but I come to you in the name of the Lord." And he took one of those stones, the very first stone, and he wound it up in his sling and his slingshot, and it hit Goliath in the only vulnerable place. There was a spot on the forehead of the helmet that he actually sunk the rock into, and it knocked Goliath out. And while he was out, David actually went over to his body, picked his sword out of his sheath, and cut his head off. So Goliath was defeated, and David became a champion. He was the mighty champion. Saul had promised that whoever killed Goliath could marry his daughter, and we find that he gave his daughter Michal to David to be married. David was a hero, and everything was wonderful. But then we find that Saul's anger and anguish and jealousy was turned against David. And so we find that David was on the run from Saul. Saul was attempting to kill him. David and Saul's son Jonathan were best of friends. Jonathan actually helped David escape not once but twice from his father. And he actually escapes to the land of Nob and of Gath. And he is on the run, he and his mighty men on the run away from the King Saul. David gathers his men, and whenever they were hiding They were kept safe and protected by some of the priests of God. When Saul found out about that, he slayed the priests of God. David fights the Philistines, and Saul pursues David. And then finally, Jonathan and David make a covenant that they would always have one another. They would, be there for one another, and that if something happened, that David would take care of Jonathan's family. And we find that there were times whenever Saul was in situations. There was once when David and his men were hiding in a cave, and Saul came in, and he was there to have a bit of private time to relieve himself. And David was able to cut part of his robe off, and he showed it to Saul, and he said, "See, I was this close, but I did not kill you. Why are you chasing after me?" And then another time, he was able to prove to Saul that he was not after him to kill him. And we find that there's just a lot of fighting. The Amalekites and the Philistines, they're not, they're battling at this point. In 1 Samuel chapter 28, we find that Saul goes to the witch of Endor. And when I mean a witch, I'm actually talking about a regular witch. And he actually has her conjure up the spirit of Samuel so that he could talk to him, and it was not a good thing. But we find that um, this is how wicked that Saul had gotten. And at the end, they were in battle, and Saul was mortally wounded, and asking his armor bearer to kill him. His armor bearer would not kill him, so he fell upon his own sword and committed suicide. In that same battle, his son Jonathan also was killed. So now we find that David is in the right place to take over the kingdom. At first, he mourns the deaths of Saul and Jonathan, even though David knew that he was king, even though he knew that Saul had turned to evil ways. He still loved and respected Saul, and because he was the anointed and chosen of God at one point, and David appreciated that and he honored that. Then David in chapter 2 of 2 Samuel was actually made the king over Judah. Um, and it took a bit of time, but within the next few chapters, he was made the king over all of Israel, and he moved the capital from where it was to in Judah to Jerusalem. And God made a covenant at this time to build a house of God for David, or David was going to build a house for God. David consolidates his kingdom, and then he finds Jonathan's crippled son. And at that point, he brought him back to the kingdom and back to the palace and treated him like one of his own sons. And we end chapter 10 with David warring against the Ammonites and Syrians. And then we find that David also kind of ran into of his own trouble. He was in his palace, and he went to the roof, and he was looking out, and he saw Bathsheba, and she was bathing on the rooftop, which was down lower than his rooftop, so he could actually see her. He was moved by lust for Bathsheba, and he sent for her. And the terrible thing, the second or the most terrible part of this is the fact that Bathsheba was married, and her husband was away with the military. And it wasn't long until Bathsheba found out that she was with child, and the child belonged to David because her husband had been away in battle for quite some time. So David had sent for him to come home in hopes that he would spend some time with his wife and that they could claim the pregnancy was his. And he refused to be with his wife. He didn't feel like it was right for him to have those luxuries and to sleep in a bed when his own troops were actually out sleeping on the cold ground. So try as he might, David could not make that happen. So when Bathsheba's husband went back to the battlefield, he was instructed to go to the front lines, and there he was killed. And then David brings Bathsheba to the palace. But that wasn't the end of the sorrows for David. When the child was born, he actually died. And David was faced with the consequences of his sin. Nathan, the prophet at the time, after Samuel had already passed away, Nathan took over as the prophet, and he was the prophet for David. And David actually repents in chapter 12 of 2 Samuel. There was a lot of family issues that was going on. There were a lot. David actually had many wives, many concubines. So a lot of his children were not full siblings. They were half siblings, and there was a lot of turmoil, and their child turned against child. And we find that Absalom had killed his brother, and he had done that because he had taken advantage of their sister, and it was just a long, drawn out situation. But then he let Absalom return, even though he had been sent away in exile. David let Absalom return, but when he returned, he rebelled against David. They tried to attack David, but he was slain, and David actually mourns the death of that. And then David was restored to the throne. David was very musical. He played the harp, and he wrote a lot. If you will, when we get to the book of Psalms, you'll find that David wrote much of the book of Psalms, and those were all songs of praise and deliverance and different things for them. We find that David's last words are in chapter 23, and um, then he kind of ends everything on a pretty sour note because he took a census and he wasn't supposed to. That was something that he had done that was wrong, and there was a great plague that hit the land, and 70,000 people died, and it was just a pretty rough time at the end for King David. And that's pretty much where we leave him. The last part of 2 Samuel is in chapter 24, verse 18. It says, "That day God came to David and said to him, Go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Uraunah and the Jebusite. So David went up and to do what the Lord had commanded him." And it says in the last verse, "David built an altar there to the Lord and sacrificed burnt offerings and peace offerings. And the Lord answered his prayer for the land, and the plague on Israel was stopped." And that's where we end the book of Second Samuel. So I hope that you've enjoyed learning about David and Saul and David, and with Samuel and Nathan. Our next lesson is going to be First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles. Hope that you will tune in and join us for that as well. Thank you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.